Hello and welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us today with the Improving Restorations webinar series. This is a collaboration between the University of Minnesota Extension and the Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program, the webinar series that has Minnesota's restoration practitioners talking. Today, you will be learning about the concepts of natural channel design. I'm Wade Johnson with the Minnesota DNR, also on behalf of the Border and Water and Soil Resources, working on the Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program. Our program collaborates with experts to evaluate restorations and identify problems of what's working and what's not, and ongoing challenges, and working through venues such as this webinar series to share information to improve future restorations. Our collaborating partners on the webinar series are the University of Minnesota Extension, Dr. Dan Larkin with the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology, and the U of M Extension is here with us today and will field questions for the Q&A after the presentations. Extension offers an online ecological restoration training certificate. This 150-hour program offers 5 courses offered twice a year. It covers the foundational skills to engage in restoration projects. This is an exceptional resource in Minnesota, and I encourage you all to check it out and share with your colleagues. During our webinar today, as questions and comments arise, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. There's also a chat feature you can use if you're having technical issues, but please do use the Q&A function to field questions that we'll have, and we will field those after both of the presentations are completed. At the end of this webinar today, when you close the Zoom, pop-up will appear prompting you to take a short survey. Please take a few moments to take this survey as it provides valuable feedback to us about your interests and potential topics for future webinars. Webinar series will be recorded and available on Extension's website. The second webinar in this two-part series will focus on streams, will feature Minnesota Trout Unlimited and local implementers focused on stream habitat improvements, planning, and collaborations. That will be 2 weeks from today on April 30th. Now, to introduce our speakers for today, Karl Koller and Nick Proulx of the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Nick and Karl have served for 17 years as Clean Water Legacy Specialists for Northeastern and Southeastern Minnesota, respectively, for the Minnesota DNR, Division of Ecological and Water Resources. Their work focuses on stream geomorphic assessment and clean water studies, monitoring, and providing technical assistance on stream restorations and mitigation. Our first speaker, Karl Koller, received his master's degree in fisheries from the University of Minnesota and began working as a fisheries specialist with Minnesota Department of Natural Resources in 1993. In his fisheries position, he was the lead stream worker and was first introduced to stream habitat restoration projects. Among other activities, he has assisted in providing training in fluvial geomorphology, stream mitigation, and road stream crossing design and assessment. Our second speaker will be Nick Proulx with Minnesota DNR. Nick received his BS in environmental biology in 1995 and MS in resource analysis, GIS, in 1997 from St. Mary's University in Winona, and has led to his 25 plus year career with Minnesota DNR. In those 25 years, he's held many different positions, all related to aquatic ecology assessment and restoration of lakes and rivers. And with that, I will let Karl take it away. Karl, if you want to share your screen.
Okay. You see my screen now?
Yes, it's good.
Okay. So I'm going to not really dive into the natural channel design side of things so much. I'm going to leave that to Nick. So I'm going to cover more, just show the concepts of restoration and some of the basic background understanding of form and process in stream channels. So a lot of the work we're doing is driven by the Clean Water Act, which requires that we address impaired streams in our state. The number one impairment that we've identified in most of our streams is excess sediment, which is also the number one impairment nationwide. We look at these streams and say, what are we going to do to fix them? We've got this huge list of best management practices to think about and choose from. So how do we make a decision on what the best approach is? If we looked at what's been done over the years, this is data from 2010 to 20 from Clean Water Fund grants, and we see that the majority of it's being put into BMPs for agricultural processes. And if we look at stream channel restoration type work, it only makes up about 1% of the projects that were funded. If we talk about stream channel restoration, you know, some of the things that come up is that it can be viewed as costly. They're typically larger projects, so need larger amounts of cash to do them. They're somewhat complex. We're dealing with complex relationships here in physics with dealing with streams and ecological functions of these systems. There's risk involved if you don't get the design correct. Not to mention, it seems like there's always a huge rain event shortly after you complete one of these projects. So why would we consider doing a restoration project versus some of these other approaches? Well, let's take a look at an example of a case study from a project where they applied a different BMP approach. And this was in Iowa, a paired watershed study, where they had primarily row cropped areas, and they decided they were going to convert 15% of the row crop to permanent cover, including native prairie. They estimated with the Russell model they would see about a 46% reduction in suspended sediment export from the Walnut Creek where they did this work. At the same time, there was actually an increase in row cropping in the other watershed, but they saw no significant difference in the amount of suspended sediment that was exported after 10 years after implementing this. And they found that the majority of the sediment was coming from stream banks, and this BMP wasn't addressing those stream bank sources of sediment. Stream banks were also the primary source of phosphorus in the system as well. And we see the same thing in Minnesota. Studies with the university have looked at the Minnesota River watershed and estimated the amount of sediment that's coming off the fields. And in most cases, it's considerably less than 30%. And the rest of that is coming from near channel sources. It gets even more exaggerated when we get into the northeast forested area, where almost all the sediment is coming from these near channel sources. And we also see a corresponding release of phosphorus when all this erosion is occurring, and the phosphorus that's tied up in the soils as they erode can contribute up to 2/3 of the phosphorus that we're seeing exported from these systems. So when we track overall the conditions in our streams, we're not really seeing dramatic changes in suspended sediment or phosphorus concentrations in these systems as we implement restoration approaches or BMPs. So what are we seeing? Why are we seeing these high sediment loads in our streams? Well, that brings us to this idea of channel stability. Here's an example of the same stream that flows through Yellowstone Park. One part was overgrazed, the other part wasn't. We see the difference between the two is the ungrazed stable section has an erosion rate of 0.0010 tons of sediment per year per foot versus 0.93 tons in the unstable reach. We can look at that on a model of this exact situation if we look at these suspended sediment curves that were developed for Colorado streams, collecting suspended sediment concentrations at Bankful for a variety of drainage areas and graphing that suspended sediment concentration over drainage area. And you see there's two different lines here. There's a blue line and a red line. The blue line represents the slope for the stable streams. The red line represents the slope for the unstable streams. If we compare, say, 50 square kilometers, the concentration of sediment in the stable stream would produce about 15 milligrams per liter of sediment. The unstable streams are producing over 10 times that amount of sediment. So this brings us to the idea of what do we mean exactly by stream stability? And here's a definition we often like to use: the ability of a stream to transport the water and sediment of its watershed in such a way to maintain its basic shape over time without either aggrading or degrading. And I'm guessing a lot of you have seen this Lane's bounce equation, which is sort of visualization of this idea, which is if the hydraulic energy of flowing water to erode and deposit sediment is in balance with the amount of sediment being generated, the stream's going to maintain its same basic shape. It's a dynamic equilibrium in that it can change over time, but the difference is it will change very slowly in a stable system versus an unstable system. So we're not talking about something like this that never moves. It can adjust over time, but like I said, those adjustments are typically very slow. And there's often discussions about whether this concept of stability is even appropriate or if streams really should be more dynamic. And it's always difficult to tell because man has altered so many of our watersheds across the world. But this study in Australia looked at the amount of movement in the Proulx River. Over a 1600-year period, there was very low lateral migration, floodplain aggradation, and very few avulsions that occurred in that time period, suggesting that when you have undisturbed watersheds, you can have stable streams that are going to maintain their same basic form over time. So one of the main things we see with channels that have become destabilized is that they become incised. They cut down into their bed, they downgrade, create a larger channel. And so in this example, I'm showing the channels at about a 1.5 year frequency flood event. So the stable channel at the 1.5 year flood is about filled up to the top of its bank, whereas the incised channel, it's nowhere near the top of the bank. And to think about the consequences of this when we get to larger floods, we need to think about the concept of shear stress. And here's a basic shear stress equation, which is simply the specific weight of water times the depth times the slope. So the deeper the water, the steeper the channel, the more shear stress that's directed at the bank to pick up and move particles. And this is closely related to stream power, which is the amount of material the stream is able to move. So now if we look at these same two channels at, say, a 25 or 50 year flood and look what happens to the shear stress as we go from base flow up to the flood elevation, we see that there's somewhat of a proportional increase in shear stress as we're filling the channel up because it's getting deeper. But the depth doesn't increase proportional to the increase in discharge, so we don't see a dramatic increase in shear stress as we get into the larger and larger flood event. Contrast that with the channel that's incised and doesn't get out of its bank, and the shear stress is going to just keep increasing. So that means more energy directed at eroding the bed and banks of the channel. When you start this incision process, and it initiates what we call a channel evolution process. And so once the stream becomes destabilized and starts downcutting into its bed, we have that exact situation I just described, where you have higher and higher shear stress, eroding the banks and bed. As the banks get steeper, they start eroding out and the channel starts widening out. Eventually, it can get so wide that you've now got the water is flowing at a much shallower level, so you have lower shear stress in this really wide channel, which could cause aggradation in the center of the channel, but puts more shear stress on the side banks as it widens out. Over time, you can eventually have a head cut move through and create a new stable channel at this lower elevation. And that large channel that I just showed you now becomes the valley, the new valley for this new stable channel. But if you think about the amount of sediment that was moved from one cross section, multiply that out by the entire valley, you can see why there's huge amounts of sediment being generated when we see channel evolution processes. So when we see all these streams in Minnesota that are impaired for sediment, what we're often seeing or typically seeing is streams that are in the middle of one of these channel evolution sequences. They're trying to work their way towards finding a new stable state. What's driving the channel instability and starting these channel evolution processes? Well, we've got records of direct channel manipulations as well as altered hydrology all across the state of Minnesota. I think direct channel alterations is pretty obvious what we're talking about. Altered hydrology can be, the combination of the loss of wetlands over time, impervious surface from urban areas, and then one of the big contributors is drainage practices in agricultural areas. And probably a lot of you are familiar with this study that was done by Schottler that tracked gauges over time and found that runoff rates were increasing over time. So you're getting more water for the same size event. And most of this was traced back to increased drainages that was occurring in these watersheds of the Minnesota River Basin. And when they looked at what was happening to the stream channels through air photos, they found that those channels were enlarging proportional to the amount of increase in runoff rates. So more water was creating larger channels. So what people often go to after that is thinking that, well, if more water is causing these instability issues, what we need to do is turn the faucet down and slow down the flow in order to reduce the sediment getting into our streams. But let's step back to this model that shows the curves that were developed from a stable versus an unstable stream. We've got drainage area on the bottom. A drainage area is going to be directly related to discharge. So if we want to take a look at what might happen if we reduce discharge, it would be the same thing as reducing the drainage area and seeing what would change. So if we talk about a 20% reduction in hydrology from where we were, we would be looking at moving from 160 milligrams per liter in this system to 130 milligrams, far from the concentration that we see in a stable stream that's well connected to its floodplain. Obviously, there's a lot of benefits from water storage that you gain by doing these projects. I'm not saying we shouldn't do them, but if your goal is really to reduce the amount of sediment that's coming out of these streams that's primarily coming from stream banks, it's going to be difficult to do with water storage, if not impossible. And in agricultural areas, you're going to have a tough time finding enough space to put in that many projects to actually have a measurable effect. Another approach that's often suggested or applied is bank stabilization to reduce erosion rates into the stream channel. But what we see is what happens here. Those three arrows that move down the channel were actually representing different years that they went in and put riprap. And each time they put in riprap, there was more erosion that occurred downstream. And you can see that downstream of this last arrow. If we look at the air photo from this, 1991 versus 2003, and we overlay the 1991 channel on the 2003 channel, you can see in this short period of time, this stream has laterally migrated quite a distance. This is suggesting that there's larger instability issues with this channel that can't just be fixed with some bank stabilization at certain points along the stream. We need to think about systemically what's happening in the system. So to systemically think about these systems, the In-Stream Flow Council developed this 5 components of riverine systems, and it helps us to think about these streams in systematic ways and setting objectives for projects we do. They're shown as puzzle pieces because they're all interrelated. It makes it easier to talk about them individually, but you quickly find that they overlap with their processes. So the first one I want to talk about is connectivity. Physically, connectivity, we usually refer to it 3 different ways: lateral connectivity, longitudinal connectivity, and vertical connectivity. So from a longitudinal connectivity, what we're worried about for stream processes is movement of water and movement of sediment. If we disrupt that, we start creating aggradation issues and degradation issues. Obviously, there's also biological issues for connectivity for fish and organisms to move upstream and downstream as well. And this longitudinal connectivity and continuity of connectivity, that doesn't only apply to the stream channel itself, but also to the floodplain. So that during large floods, the floodplain is acting like a large river, and we're moving sediment through the channel and depositing sediment in the floodplain. So from a lateral connectivity perspective, I already walked through this issue with the increased shear stress when we don't have good lateral connectivity and our channel is incised. Having a channel connected to the floodplain is important during these larger floods events because that's how streams often process sediment that's coming from upstream. In this example, they found that 30% of the upstream sediment was being deposited in the floodplain. This doesn't happen if you're not connected to the floodplain with your stream channel. There's also, biological connections that we need to be aware of that maybe don't drive the processes as much that we're talking about here, but it's worth reminding ourselves that the riparian area is important. So in these 2 studies, the first one, they found that there was better tree growth in riparian trees in Alaska when they were adjacent to streams that supported salmon runs because they postulated that the salmon were contributing nutrients that improved the growth of the trees. And vice versa, in California, they found that the young salmon seemed to be surviving better in streams that had more dense hardwoods, and specifically red alders, and they believe that the nitrogen fixation by red alders helped with the productivity in the streams and increased growth rates. Connectivity to the floodplain also has an impact on groundwater elevations. The stream is sort of like the drain for the groundwater, so when we have a higher channel that's connected to the floodplain, we have more anaerobic denitrification that can occur. And we also see that the longer the plants are in contact with water, the more vegetative assimilation that occurs of nitrogen as well. There's also this vertical connectivity, which is important for nutrient processing too, the connection of the stream flow to the hyperrheic zone where nutrient cycling also occurs. Studies have found that hyporheic exchange increases when you have greater bed diversity. So riffle pool structures help to force water into the hyporheic zone, whereas if you have a plain bed stream, which we often see if they're ditched or unstable, aren't going to have as good of hyporheic exchange. Now, hydrology, of course, is driving all this, and mainly it's hydraulics, and hydraulics really fits into some of the connectivity and geomorphology issues that I'm talking about, but I just didn't want to skim past that. Water quality, I've already talked about. Sediment is the primary driver for water quality, and I just want to touch a little more on expand on the example with the actual real life example of the impacts of incised channels. So here we see a study in Iowa. The two photos, 98 and 2014, are HEC-RAS models of the same size flood or discharge. But from 1998 to 2014, the channel became more and more incised to the point that this flood was entirely contained within the channel by 2014. And what they measured was over a 60% decrease in the amount of phosphorus and sediment captured by the floodplain, and an increase in the amount that was being exported, as well as stream power increase, so the rate of incision increased too as it became more incised. They concluded that these increased contributions to watershed load may mask sediment and phosphorus reductions achieved through edge of field practices, the BMPs, thus making it critical that stage and progression of channel evolution be taken into consideration when addressing sediment and phosphorus loading at the watershed scale. Which brings us to biology, which is often our measure of how healthy a stream is, and one of the things we're often most concerned about, how healthy the stream is. So with the organisms that live in the stream, the different fish, different life stages have different habitat needs. The different invertebrates have different habitat needs. It's important that we have diverse habitats, including deep pools, riffles, wood in the stream, in order to maintain healthy ecological function in these systems. When we have situations like this in the East Fork San Juan River, where the stream became destabilized, combination of the loss of habitat, especially pools, along with the consequences of increased ice issues during the winter, resulted in this reach of stream actually being the lowest abundance of fish ever sampled by Colorado Parks and Wildlife in all their sampling and all their time. Whereas reach upstream of here, where they had restored it, there were the fish population returned to higher abundance levels. So that another impact of excess sediment on habitat is embeddedness of gravels. We see that when we have more and more embeddedness of gravels with fines, we see a reduction in the amount of EPT taxa invertebrates, as well as lithophilic or gravel spawning fish abundance in these systems. A study that pretty well pulls together the impacts of an incised channel when comparing it to paired with a channel that was well connected, looking at both water quality and biology, was this one, which found that the incised stream had higher turbidity, more solids, had poorer water quality in general. The incised channel had half the biodiversity and 1/4 the fish biomass. They concluded that these results suggest that channel incision is associated with a complex of ecological stressors that includes channel erosion, hydrologic perturbation, and water quality and physical habitat degradation. So, sort of to sum it up, the channel evolution impacts mean we have higher erosion rates, which causes decreased water quality, decreased habitat quality and diversity. We lose that floodplain connectivity and all the important processes that are related to that. So channel instability impacts all physical and biological processes and functions. And to significantly counteract the impacts of channel instability requires returning a channel to a more stable form. So when we talk about form, we're talking about fluvial geomorphology. Fluvial is flowing water, geo is earth, morphology is shape. So it's sort of how water shapes the earth, but we also need to look at it the other direction of how the form of the channel drives the processes of erosion, deposition, and sediment transport. So I'm going to spend a little time just going through the sort of this idea of how form drives process. So when we talk about form, we're typically describing it as dimension, pattern, and profile. The dimension pattern profile are really descriptions of these ratios. And these ratios are what define how a stream and its valley handle the energy of flowing water, transported sediment, and its debris as well. And so if you change these ratios, you're going to have an impact on those processes, physical processes. Those ratios are also the basis for Dave Roskin's stream classification system. So you see the profile, the dimension, and the pattern delineating the different stream types. So why is the form so important? It's because of how it affects those processes. When we think about a meander channel, the valley that it's running through has a certain slope. As you meander a channel, that's reducing the slope of the channel, which is reducing the energy of that flowing water. Furthermore, the meandering is sort of has the same effect on reducing energy as a skier going downhill and slaloming. So as you're going straight, you're accelerating. As soon as you make a turn, your skis dig in and dig a pool into the snow, slows you down and dissipates some of that energy, pick up speed again, accelerate, and then slow down again in the next turn. Streams are doing the same thing with their meandering, creating pools and riffle sequences. So you get this sort of slowing and speeding up function, but this profile that's created also creates the pools and riffles that create some diversity of habitat for the species that live in these systems. The thing we often focus on the most when we talk about form, and Nick will touch on, is the channel dimension, or what the stream looks like in cross section. And when we talk about the dimension, we're talking about not only like the cross section area, the size, but also the shape. So is it wide and shallow or narrow and deep? So to understand why streams sort of take on the size they take on, Woolman and Miller came up with this model, which shows, first of all, the frequency of different flood events over time in this hypothetical channel. You see base flow is the most common flow. The floods and the droughts are very uncommon. Then over this, they overlaid a sediment discharge rating curve. So how much sediment is being moved by each one of these discharges. Low flows aren't able to move any sediment. And the bigger the flow, the larger the volume of sediment being moved. If you multiply these two curves by each other, you get a graph that looks something like this. So it's a matter of frequency times the amount of sediment being moved. And so the flow that moves the most sediment in this model is what we call the effective discharge. So the 100-year flood moves a lot of sediment once every 100 years. The effective discharge is happening much more frequently, and over that 100-year period moves a lot more sediment. And that typically corresponds to about the 1.2 to 1.8 year flood frequency. And if you go out to the gauge and look at that point where the 1.2 to 1.8 year flood frequency is, you'll see it's on a stable system. It's also the incipient point of flooding, where the stream will just is just about to flood out into its floodplain. This is where the term bankful discharge comes from, which is pretty much correlated with what we call the effective discharge. So it's that 1.2 to 1.8 year discharge that's sizing the channel to the size it is. Of course, the overall shape of the channel can vary a lot, and it has an impact on the hydraulics and the shear stress in the channel. So here's 3 cross sections from the same stream at different locations during the same discharge with velocity isovels. So these are feet per second. And you can see how a smaller channel is going to have higher velocities, higher shear stress versus a wide channel with a high width depth ratio. So when you look at the difference in velocities in these different cross sections, you need to understand that that's going to have an impact on shear stress and sediment transport. So not only the size, but the shape of the channel. And we need to take these things into consideration when we're looking at restoring channels. So here's the Cannon River, a bend in the Cannon River in 1991. And here's where it was by 2013. You can see that it's laterally migrated. Probably didn't help that all the trees were removed from the outside of the bank. Over time, it's widened. So the gray on this 2013 image is the overlay of the 1991 channel. And you also see the formation of a mid-channel bar that's occurring. And remember when I said when channels become wider, it's reducing the shear stress and you start getting deposition in the center. And it increases the stress on the outside of the bend. So in 2013, they did a towwood project with some stream barbs put in to stabilize the bank. Of course, they had a huge rain event that came right after they did this. And a portion of the towwood actually blew out at the tail end of this towwood project. And when you look at where that occurred, it was right adjacent to the mid-channel bar, which had enlarged further, which mid-channel bars will put higher shear stress on the bank. So when they were doing this project, if they had looked at the channel width and got a more appropriate channel width on this, they would have more efficient sediment transport through this reach and wouldn't have had to deal with the mid-channel bar forming, causing high near bank shear stress. Of course, in a system like this, there's probably a lot of other things you'd have to take into consideration as well on your design, but it demonstrates how important it is to get the correct channel dimensions. So hopefully by now you see that form and process are interrelated. People talk about form-based versus process-based restoration, and they can't really be separated because the form is determining those processes. And not only is it determining the processes for sediment transport, but creating a lot of the habitat that the organisms need. So you really need to make sure you have an appropriate dimension pattern profile for a stream to remain stable. Of course, in the past, we'd look at a stream like this that takes forever to get from point A to point B and think Mother Nature doesn't know what's right. And to get water off the land quicker, we just need a bigger, straighter channel. And when we do that, we forget about the fact that these channels are moving sediment. So here you can see that the stream is trying to get back to a meandered state by a grading. If it's too wide and can't move its sediment, and it's trying to get back to the same sort of channel dimension and trying to get a pattern back as well, because that's more the stable state. People also, when they talk about whether channels are really stable or not, say, well, what about the really big floods? Aren't those going to be altering things and make channels more dynamic? Well, here's Coffee Creek in Duluth, Minnesota, following about 2 days after a 500-year flood event occurred. And this is on a golf course where the a pond had been dug in the stream at this location, and somehow the Kentucky bluegrass roots didn't manage to hold the bank together during this 500-year flood. But if we look at this other reach, same thing 2 days after the flood, it maintained its same basic form. It is still stable after going through that 500-year flood. It was well connected to its floodplain, had a stable form, had a healthy riparian area as well. The interesting thing is both these pictures are from Coffee Creek, and they're about 300 yards apart from each other. So the stable stream was resilient to these large flood events, largely due to its connection to the floodplain, where the system that was unstable is the one that really suffered the most damage. So we get back to this idea of, we're not doing many stream restoration projects. And it shows in that we're not seeing real great improvements in our habitat scores as we're evaluating what's happening across the state. When we talk about doing stream restoration, people often get confused about what we mean. So we're not necessarily saying, the Google definition of we're going to put this thing back to where it was 300 years ago. We recognize that we've changed the hydrology. We've done a lot of things with land use. So when we're restoring streams, there's different definitions we can use, but the idea is we'll take into consideration where we're at now and what the constraints are and what the boundary conditions are, and design a stable form for that channel, recognizing that it may have to adjust over time. And getting back to the idea of the Clean Water Act, it didn't just say, go out and identify where there's excess sediment and remove the sediment or stop it from getting in the water. What it says is the objective of the act is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. It's telling us we need to address these as systems. We need to address the ecological and physical functions, not just reduce the amount of phosphorus, for example, in the stream. So with the the Clean Water Act requiring this sort of systemic restoration as opposed to just addressing the individual constituents we use to identify impairments. In many cases, restoration of natural functions to impaired systems may only be possible by making channel restoration part of the solution. I think that's a case in a lot of our systems. Channel restoration approaches need to account for how form drives physical process. They're inseparable, and restoration needs to be based on form as much as considering the processes. And with that, I'm going to let Nick take over and walk you through natural channel design specifically.
Yeah, hello everybody, good afternoon. So Karl outlined the complexity of streams and sort of the idea that it's important to address some of the issues we're seeing with streams. And so now I'm going to step through some of the concepts of stream natural channel design specifically, discuss briefly about some of the critiques, and then discuss some of the results we're seeing on projects we're doing. So there are 9 steps for natural channel design. You start, with the assessment of the watersheds to surveying, applying relationships, designing, and then monitoring, effectiveness monitoring. So I'll unpack each one of these in more detail here. So the first step, assessing conditions. So the primary reason you're going to be doing the assessment piece of this is that you want to make sure that wherever you pick the location in the watershed that you're going to do a restoration, that upstream or downstream processes won't undermine the project and the investment that you have in this location, right? So this is an example of a more in-depth study, a sediment source identification study in Wells Creek, where we looked at percentages coming from stream banks versus overland, and the causes of excess sediment. And so you could see pretty quickly on some of these heat maps and so forth, where we can pick up areas that would make a lot of sense to do in channel work, or areas we may not want to deal with at all. Obviously, that's not always true or always possible to do these kinds of detailed studies, but there are tools like the WAF and some other things that we can look at what's happening upstream, downstream. Site visits are useful. So if you're at a site and you're looking upstream and downstream, and you have excessive erosion all the way up and down, then maybe there's a systemic issue here, and maybe this isn't the best place to be doing work. Maybe you should be doing something else in the upper part of the watershed. So know when to say no. The next step is pretty quick. It's to determine the stable stream type and valley type. So this is looking at the physical features of the area that you're about to restore. So the valley determines the stream that you're dealing with. And so, once you have those characteristics of the valley, and then what that potential stream type, that stability, that stable stream type would be, then you have an idea of the next step of looking at the reference conditions, right? So reference reach is not pristine or anything like that. It's what Karl outlined in terms of the definition of stability. It's passing its water sediment without degrading and degrading over time. So it's just a stream that's working right now, right, in nature. And so the criteria for determining where to go or to look for these reference reaches is ideally you want to be in the same hydrophysiographic region. So that means you has similar sediment and flow regimes, underlying geology, slope, sinuosity, all these different characteristics, boundary conditions that your proposed site has. And so the idea here is that if it works over there, it'll work here if we minimize the amount of variables. And then you also want to stay within one stream order. Obviously, that can be difficult to find in some of the more impacted areas of our state, and in other areas. There are ways you can look at adjacent watersheds and get outside of some of these areas, or find smaller stretches that may work too. The next step is kind of the big one. This is where you're out there surveying the reference reach. You're collecting cross sections, dimension pattern profile metrics for all of for the reference. You're including multiples of all the riffles and the pools and so forth, so you get a range of values. And so the next step here is to develop those, work up those data of the existing reach and the reference reach, and the metrics will then be transformed into dimensionless ratios, and those dimensionless ratios then allow you to scale that information that you just collected on that reference reach and move it then to the proposed reach, where you want to do the restoration. And so that means you can, we have different drainage areas, different sizes, and it'll accommodate for that. So these are just examples of some of the metrics you'll be looking at in terms of dimension first. This is, for riffles and pools, you're looking at area with max depth, mean depth. The inner berm dimensions as well. These are the low flow channel. That's going to be very critical in design as well. And then you also do that for your run and glide, but the riffle and pool are the primary ones you'd be looking at. One thing to note about dimensions, channel dimensions specifically, don't rely solely on hydrologic models or geometry curves, because there can be some errors in those. Specifically, there's an example here of a drainage area that we have non-effective flow, and so your drainage area is manipulated or different from what your relationship you think you have. Same thing with the curves. If they're not broken out by stream type, there's differences in dimensions or specifically widths when it comes to stream types. So use many tools. You can use them as a sort of starting point, but don't rely on them solely. The pattern metrics here is the key here is to use not only your reference reach distance, but you're going to want to look beyond the reference reach. You want to be able to measure a lot of range of these variables. And so don't be afraid and don't ignore unique pieces of that stream channel. One of the things we tend to do is just find elements of the stream that look good to us, and we just kind of focus on that. But it's important to actually look at what the odd things about the stream, the unique pieces of it, and make sure we're measuring those so we can incorporate some of the variability that these streams have. Here's just an example of the pattern geometry ratios. And so visually you could see once they become dimensionless, we can then move them back and forth. Have profile metrics. Here you're looking at all of the facet lengths, max depths and slope, and pool-to-pool spacing. Again, these will become dimensionless within the design template. So one note about taking these geomorphic relationships, it is an iterative process. It can be challenging in terms of integrating all of this information into a plan set or into CAD, for instance. One of the things that is an issue is that when you make a change to one of these pieces, whether it's dimension, pattern, or profile, they're connected with others. And so other things will have to be adjusted. And so depending on the tools you're using to do this workup, it can be challenging. And so understand that it is iterative and build in enough time to do that. The other thing that we see quite a bit is when you don't get your bankful dimensions correct, you see more failures when it comes to design. And if you look at the bottom photo there, that's an overwide channel, and that's the most common piece is people overwiden their channel, and we see issues with aggradation and so forth. The next step is evaluating the sediment. So this is what we're looking at: channel capacity and competency. So competency, where the size of the particles that are moving at bankful. This will help inform our riffle composition and some other things like that. Also capacity, what's the volume of sediment that's coming towards us, and can our channel handle it? And so we're collecting bar samples and using sediment rating curves to work this information in. Rosgan did develop 2 models that would incorporate this information so that we can determine if our design channel is going to deal with the sediment that's coming with it and the sizes that's coming at it. So this is FlowSed. This is the model that basically just sets it up where it's saying this is how much is coming at you in terms of sediment. And then PowerSed is you import your design cross section, and you can determine from there if you have an appropriate size channel that would move what's coming at it. Floodplain design is the next part of this, and I think this is probably the most critical piece of the restoration, and specifically an adequately sized floodplain. We know, I think everybody has an appreciation for how beneficial floodplains are when they're connected for flood attenuation, nutrient processing, habitat, transport stability, all of those things. And one thing I'll just note here is when you're constructing floodplain continuity is extremely important. Do not try to squeeze your channel or squeeze the floodplain in and out because of constraints. It's better to keep a consistently wide channel or floodplain. So related to floodplains, we talked about, or Karl talked a lot about channel incision and some of the issues that we have with that. There are 4 ways strategies that deal with incised channels, and I'll kind of go through each one of those, and that plays into the design piece of this when it comes to floodplain design. So they'll go here, the priority 1 to priority 4. Priority 1 is the most beneficial to priority 4. So priority 1 is when you take an existing incised channel and raise the elevation of the bed back up to its historical floodplain. And so obviously the benefits here, that it can maximize your floodplain extent. You can keep the vegetation you have on that. So you have roughness already built into your design. You have all the values that come with a floodplain, a connected floodplain, which I outlined earlier, the stability and all that pieces. And it's lower construction costs. You're not moving a lot of earth. The cons of this, or the issues with this, is that within mapped FEMA floodways, there's additional printing that's required. It can be time consuming. And then if there's any infrastructure within these floodplains, that can also hamper how much you can do in terms of priority 1s. So the second priority is to take the channel and create that floodplain at the existing elevation. And so this is a pretty common, and it does avoid that FEMA issue. You still get those values of that floodplain, but some of the issues, the cons with that is that, now you have a floodplain that doesn't have that complexity. So you have to build that in, and you have to wait for that vegetation to come back. And so there is a time lag on some of the improvements you see there. And there's also increased construction costs because you're moving more dirt. Priority 3 is when you change stream type. This is primarily for gullies, and we're changing gullies into step pool morphology, so more steeper systems. The pros here is that it does stabilize the channel and can reduce localized erosion and requires minimal room. The downsides here is that the amount of floodplain that you can create is pretty minimal. It requires bank armoring, and it reduces habitat complexity. Priority 4, this is something that you would only use if you had to. This is armoring in place. It's easy to design, and it does directly reduce the amount of sediment directly into the stream. No floodplain connectivity, high risk of failure, and limited habitat values are the downsides. So now we get to later on in the steps, we're in structures. And so this is sort of what we see a lot of with designers, is that a lot of folks start with structures and say, this is what we should be doing, and this is where this should go, this is where this should go. But they are useful. They can do a lot of things for us. They can give us grade control and buy time for vegetation establishment and all these things that are to the left. But it is the later steps in natural channel design, and you need to really make sure you have your dimension and pattern profile correct first. And so I've been in a lot of meetings where we first talk about structures and placement and stuff, but we really should be making sure we get those first foundational pieces right first. Vegetation. So vegetation is one of those things in stream restoration that tends to be the first budget item sacrificed when we have issues with costs, and that's probably not, that shouldn't be the case. One of the things that we're seeing, getting input from Wade's program with the evaluation program, talking about the value of native vegetation for these projects, and we recognize that stream channels and restorations for long-term stability vegetation is absolutely critical. And if we don't get that right, then we're going to have problems in the near term. And so we got to consider how you're going to manage these different ecotypes, riparian areas versus upland and so forth. So I'm going to take a little sidestep here before we get into some of the results we're seeing from these projects and the common critiques of NCD. And really the gist of a lot of the papers and the different conversations are we seeing the ecological improvements that we claim that, and it's worth, and is it worth the investment? And so we hear a lot about the cookie cutter approach, the blueprint approach, all these things, and there's definitely some truth to it. And I want to pull out one example here that's pretty straightforward, where this is called, sort of designing to the mean. So folks can get a little nervous about actually integrating both the min and max when you look at the reference information. So we tend to get concerned about failure, and we don't define that well at the beginning of the process. So this is one of those issues that comes up pretty frequently. In addition, some of the tools we use, specifically CAD, can make it difficult to integrate some of that diversity. As practitioners, we know we can get about 80-90% of the way here with some of the analytical, analog, and empirical data pieces. But we need to recognize that there is habitat scale stuff that we can't necessarily predict, and we have to start to incorporate these oxbows and other things, these wood complexes. And so there are efforts to try to do that. It can be challenging to convince folks to do something a little bit different, but integrating wood into riffles or creating oxbows and all these things are important things we should be trying to do. All right, so let's take a few minutes to highlight a few of the projects or project results that we're seeing with natural channel design. And I'm going to use 5 components to touch on a few of them. The first one is probably the main one. When we talk about sediment, Karl outlined the impacts of streams, or sediment on streams. And so this is a restoration project in Rochester, Minnesota. It's been monitored for over 10 years now, and this is PCA data where you'll see the blue bar is downstream of the restoration, and the orange bar is upstream of the restoration. And so prior to restoration, for the most part, you're seeing an increase in sediment as you go downstream. So as you enter the proposed restoration area, it picks up additional sediment and kicks it out downstream. Post-restoration, we see the opposite. We see more sediment coming in and less sediment coming out of the restoration. And so TSS is improving. So where's that sediment going? And so we look at our long-term cross-section data. We can see it's a grading on the floodplain. So this is, again, connected floodplains are critical. The channel and the floodplain are grading at the same rate. So that idea of stability, the same dimension pattern profile are still being maintained here. And so it's still moving its sediment, but now it has a place to settle out. And we also have direct measurements of stream bank erosion. Pre-project, you can see we had 500 to 700 tons per year coming off of the stream banks. And then post-construction, we've reduced that down to 33 tons. So that's now 90+% decrease. So when we talk about nutrients, we just worked on nutrient reduction strategies paper or an appendices to that that looks at stream bank erosion and nutrients. And so obviously nutrient levels can change or vary quite a bit depending on the soil type and whatnot. But if you look at Bowser's guidance on practices, they say 1 ton of year of sediment equals 1 pound per year for phosphorus, right? And so we could tie a lot of our stream bank erosion estimates to now nutrients. And so the bottom right graph shows different practices that are used to manage phosphorus. And so the dark blue bar is the restoration. And so you see over time that cost per treatment of 1 pound of phosphorus is decreasing. And that's because the vegetation's coming in and it's doing better to hold those banks together. But if you look at like dry stormwater ponds, you have to go in there and maintain those. So there's inputs financially over time, which then decreases your cost per pound of phosphorus. So, and then overall, stream restorations are, again, expensive, can be expensive, but they are, if you're looking at it from a cost per pound treatment, they are on par with many other practices. And I could get into this because of time, but if you're interested more in nutrient processing and floodplain, Iowa State has got all sorts of things that they're doing down there. And I think Karl touched on one from Beck, but chilling and all. So again, I'm not going to get into it, but if you're interested in that, there's some really good advice and some suggestions here from those folks. Oops. Next one is hydraulics and hydrology. So this is done by counterparts here in DNR, Daniel Reinartz and Salam Murtada. They took the Cascade Creek restoration example and did a 2D model on this to show the benefits pre and post. And so you'll see, intuitively we know once you connect the floodplain, we're going to see some improvements, but what they were able to do is quantify those improvements. And so here's some examples at the 2-year, and this is, slightly larger than the bankful event, but this is the most important, part in terms of channel shape and transporting sediment over time. So we have, in general, a reduction in shear stress post-restoration, velocity, we have an increase in depth and so forth. So there's a lot of variables that they did, and I would encourage you to take a look at the report. It's out now. They also showed some flood attenuation as well. So pre and post, we see the peaks are shaved off. So groundwater. So one of the things, I mentioned the priority 1 where you're elevating that channel. Here's a study on the Art Rock Ranch in Idaho, where they elevated the channel and they measured an increase in groundwater elevation. And that was all, and an increase in base flow as well. And that was all during the time when precip was going down. Geomorphology, here we're going to lean on some of our foundational pieces, the dimension and pattern profile, and how that moves through time. So this is a Trout Brook phase 2 analysis where we looked at what the reference told us and then how it was changing. So some of the cross sections may have gotten big or so forth, but we can check that through time. So biology, here again, this Heart Rock Ranch example, they restored 3 tributaries. They have 10 years of post-restoration monitoring, and you'll see the graphic on the bottom of each one of these tributaries, and in each case, they increased their diversity post-restoration and their abundance, as well as the aquatic invertebrate IBI improved. Here's some Minnesota examples from the River Ecology Unit from Lawndale Creek and Lower Whitewater River. Similar things, pre-project and post-project, we're seeing a huge abundance or increase in abundance and diversity of fish species. And then one of the things getting close to wrapping up here, one of the things we have heard that's of value in terms of doing these restorations is having a lot of different expertise involved in the development of the design. And so a professor at Gonzaga proposed a national stream restoration certification proposal. And it's, just kind of outlines some of the expertise that would be required or is valuable when it comes to doing these projects. And you can see by the list, it's a long list. And so, but that follows because of certainly how complex these systems are. So my summary on this end of it is, again, we're integrating that process of form variables. We're looking at those sediment pieces and whatnot. NCD relies on reference conditions, analog, analytical, and empirical relationships to inform that design. Floodplains are absolutely critical. If nothing else, make them wider when you can. And then there's a lot more effectiveness monitoring out there. I just didn't have a lot of time to show all of it. There's stuff nationally, there's stuff in the state, and we need to do a better job of getting those results out to the public as a whole. So, but we're getting there. And then I also just want to mention if there is interest, there are clean water legacy specialists in addition to the River Ecology Unit, if you're aware of those folks in Fergus Falls. But there's also clean water staff as well who you can reach out to us. Feel free if you have a design or a restoration or something that you're interested in, or just questions. So feel free to reach out to us. And with that, think we'll go to questions, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Thanks, Nick. You can stop sharing your screen now so people can see you and Karl better. And we've gotten some great questions. Thank you for those excellent presentations. First question, and I'll pose this to Nick for starters. It seems like a lot of stream restoration maximizes stream meandering. Is this always appropriate? Are there situations where we'd not need or want so much meandering, or is more meander always better?
I would say it depends on the stream type. So some stream types are more sinuous than others. If you look at, I'm having a hard time. Stop. How do I stop sharing?
You have.
Oh, I
You're
have.
good.
Okay,
Yep.
good. I must have just did it by accident. All right. So yeah. So I think so it depends on stream type, right? So the steeper the channel, the less sinuous the channel is going to be, and so and there can be instances where you may want to adjust the channel away from a terrace, for instance, where you'd lose a little bit, but you're going to have to make up that distance on certain stream types. I don't know if that's getting at the question or not. Or Karl, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll maybe just add, I mean, like Nick said, it's stream type that you're aiming for. We're sort of designing for the endpoint of that channel evolution sequence. So what you want to do is try to identify where do we think this is headed. And that's going to be based on the boundary conditions you see, including like your valley slope and the width of your valley and a number of other variables. And you're going to look for a reference channel that has similar conditions for valley and boundary conditions and design based on that. So you're going to want to look at the sinuosity of that channel. If you start increasing sinuosity, which you often hear of like for mitigation projects where they're trying to get credits, it's a way of getting more credit, you're reducing the slope and you're reducing the ability to move sediment. So you really want to try to base your design, including your pattern or your sinuosity, on what your reference is telling you by matching those conditions.
Great, thank you. Another question for you, Karl. The principles you were talking about in your presentation regarding channel size and shape, could you comment on intermittent streams? How do those principles apply to intermittent streams versus perennial streams?
Yeah, they're going to have the same processes that are occurring. So there's going to be shaped by, the same sort of flows, probably the 1.5 year flows are in that range and size, to that size. So it all depends on the sediment. I mean, there are situations where you don't have alluvial systems where there's bedrock or whatever else, and then you're going to have different conditions. And what I was describing for those processes is based on alluvial systems.
Great, thanks. Nick, back over to you. Could you talk about the seasonal timing of construction for stream restoration? Is winter the best time because you can de-water best, or does frozen soil hamper the earthwork? And also, what about construction season effects on establishing vegetation?
Sure. In general, winter construction is ideal for stream restorations. You have less compaction, so when you're finished with construction, you can have a better vegetation response. Some of the problems or some of the challenges with that, though, is if it's frozen soil, they got to make sure that it that it doesn't compaction along the stream bank can be an issue in terms of chunky ice-filled chunks of soil will then create pockets and whatnot. So that it's just a construction method, or it's up to the construction company to do that well. But in general, it's preferred because yes, there's less groundwater inputs. Everything's frozen, so the BMPs for sediment and erosion control become more effective. And then, what was the second part of the question?
Effects on establishing vegetation.
Oh,
Depending on time, seasonal
yes.
timing.
Sure. So the challenge then, of course, is that nothing can grow either. So when you're so you have to rely, and if you're doing winter, then you have to deal with the spring runoff. So then if you have bare soil, even though you may have it covered and whatnot, that can be a challenge. But in general, if you're in an area where you can seed and the weather is decent in the spring, you can get a vegetation response pretty quickly for your cover crops. But those are the challenges. But so it's a trade-off. It's always a trade-off between, some of the big benefits in terms of, construction parts, and then the trade-off is the vegetation piece. So you'll have to sacrifice a little bit on that end. But to me, I think there's just less impacts if you're doing it in the winter. But then there's also rare species and so forth. There's some issues. We could be impacting those specifically turtles during that time. So that's another challenge that we have to face.
Great. Looking to the future, and either of you could address this, could you speak to methods for incorporating projected climate and land use changes into these stream restoration frameworks, and maybe talk about timelines you're designing for in terms of stream stability?
Sure. If you think of that example I showed of Coffee Creek and the response during the 500-year flood of the stable reach versus the unstable reach, the big difference was floodplain connectivity. And so what we're dealing with climate change is more larger rain events, and then there's periods of drought in between. So it's how are these streams going to be able to handle those bigger flood events that are maybe occurring more often? And the biggest thing is getting them back connected to their floodplains. So you have that release valve of getting the water out there and then making sure that you maintain that capacity and continuity of that capacity through the floodplain, so you aren't creating pinch points, which are going to create issues with destabilization within the stream channel or the floodplain. That's the biggest thing we can do. As far as sizing the channels, that's why we don't want to necessarily just hard armor things and whatever. We want them to be able to adjust as well to those changes. But you need to see a pretty significant change in your bankful discharge before you really see those adjustments. So I think the other thing that, that's where the benefits of storage comes in, is that, we can adjust our designs for our channels based on the hydrology we currently have. But if it continues to change by more, not only climate change, but by more drainage going in, on and on and on, that's going to make it difficult for these, even with these approaches, to survive. So that's where I think some of those BMPs for water storage, especially like in the floodplain, can help mitigate some of those changes, as well as just getting that floodplain connectivity everywhere we can.
Great. A question about stakeholder and public acceptance of kind of the lateral component of stream restoration. So, maybe sometimes people have the perception that streams shouldn't be moving when they're stable, but you've talked about how dynamic they are. Could you comment on kind of public and stakeholder acceptance of that dynamic nature?
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge. I think one of the pieces that's important to do at the onset is to lay out realistic expectations on what failure is and what success looks like, right? And so we don't do a good job of that typically, and we end up, post-project there'll be some erosion or something, and then some folks will call that a failure, and some folks will be fine with that, right? And so we have to be better at defining what that is. And so I think part of that is being upfront with with the proposers, with the folks who are funding this, but then also the public in general, on what you can expect from this. This isn't a static situation. These things are going to move, and so if we see some erosion, then that might be fine, or it may not be fine, but we'll make that call at that time. But again, setting the expectations is critical.
So yeah, I just want to add, if you think about when earlier on in my talk, when I talked about channel stability, it is a dynamic equilibrium, but the difference between stable and unstable channels is that rate at which it moves. And I gave that Proulx River example from Australia, which was moving millimeters per year over a 1600-year time period. So what we're talking about when we're doing restoration is not maintaining extremely dynamic systems. We're taking systems that are unstable and are moving at higher erosion rates, and that's why they're generating so much sediment, getting them to a stable form where that rate of lateral migration is actually reduced significantly. So what we hopefully are seeing is a stream that isn't moving as much. The dynamism that we see in a stable channel is significantly less than what we see in an unstable system.
Great. Sticking with kind of a people-oriented question, how do you communicate the added value of this more natural design approach to decision makers when there's so much upfront investment and expertise required versus, traditional stabilization methods like grading and hard armoring that still might provide some benefits but be simpler? So how do we sort of communicate the value add?
Well, through webinars like this when we can, but it's true, it's difficult because you sort of need to have this base understanding of how stream processes work to really appreciate the benefits of restoration versus something that's just armoring a bank so we see less sediment, because then you can see there's not as much erosion occurring on that bank. But we need to point out what the Clean Water Act is telling us, and that's that we need to restore these processes. And stabilizing a bank at one place and then having it erode further downstream, isn't working. And use those examples where we can. But any chance we can get to educate the decision makers on this funding, I think, is useful. So when we play a part in, for example, evaluating Clean Water Fund applications, grant applications, and so at the beginning of that process, we usually try to educate the people from these other agencies on, here's a way to evaluate projects that are being proposed for clean water. Here's the value of stream restoration or whatever. So hopefully, when they're scoring those grants, the ones that have stream restoration as a component are getting judged well alongside the other DMP approaches.
And the other part of that is multiple benefits. You could do a lot with just grading and stabilizing and meet some goals, right? You could stop the erosion from happening, but you're not getting that other ecological response or that lift as you could with something more, a design or a restoration that's more holistic.
Yeah, I think we probably have time for one more question, and this is getting into kind of the nitty-gritty of implementation. So how do you balance, sort of these goals that you've outlined for multiple benefits with the constraints of, limited space, adjacent infrastructure and utilities, property boundaries, budgeting and permitting requirements?
How much time do we have?
There's
a lot. Minutes. I'll let Nick talk about permitting. I'll mention he covered different approaches for like addressing incised channels, and some of them are remeandering and raising them up to the higher elevation, and he mentioned how that can raise some issues with like FEMA, but it might give us the best functioning system. The other is lowering the channel, but then the third one is actually changing from a meandered channel to more of a step pool system with a smaller floodplain. And so that's often done in those situations where we have limited room, or if we have infrastructure that we're trying to protect. So it's dissipating the energy through step pools versus through meandering, and doesn't need as much floodplain capacity. And we're getting a system that's more focused on just sediment transport, and we aren't really getting those sediment deposition in the floodplain features. But in those situations, that opportunity maybe just doesn't exist. But then the permitting issue is a whole other issue. I'll let Nick talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, for constraints, I think that's you're always going to have constraints on projects. So there's always going to be trade-offs. So you're going to have to make a decision on what's important and when you should, when you shouldn't go forward with something. But in terms of permitting, yes, that's been a hot topic lately. There's a continuous improvement project happening right now here at the DNR, and some other agencies, and all the other agencies, regulatory agencies are involved, as well as LGU partners, some of which are probably online here. And they're going to be looking at ways that we can make this process a little bit more efficient. and still maintain the same protections that we have. If you look historically, a lot of these regulations are, they're all developed in the 70s, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, NEPA, all of them. And so they were designed at the time to address some really serious environmental issues, and they've been extremely successful at mitigating a lot of that. And so if you fast forward to today, we're still using those same tools, and now we're applying them to restorations as well. And so, so it's a balancing act between making sure that we don't it's truly restoration that we're trying to accomplish here, and we're trying to have environmental benefits. And then with the obvious, you still have to do something. You have to crack some eggs to make the omelet, right? So it's going to be messy at times. So we're going to have to figure out, what does adequate controls look like, so hopefully there'll be more to come on that in the next year or so, as that committee wraps up some of their work, or they're starting it now, so it'll take a year.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both so much for presenting today. Thank the audience for joining us and for your excellent questions. Please come back in 2 weeks. April 30th, we'll be talking about stream improvement, planning, and collaborations. We'll hear from Jennifer Beedman with Minnesota Trout Unlimited and Matt Kempinger with the Wabasha SWCD. And last but not least, when the Zoom closes, a survey will pop up, and we'd really appreciate it if you could complete that survey. So thanks, Nick. Thanks, Karl.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for coming.